Just before Venerable Chuni went to India, she gave an impromptu BBC talk. She had about the same time that I had to give this talk. And she said something in her talk that I really caught my attention, but I wasn't equipped at the time to comment on it. And she was making the statement that, taking down monuments is maybe important, but it's not the solution. And I'd like to give you my ideas about what I have about monuments, especially in this country. So I'm going to give you some background first, and it will lead to a certain point, I hope. And if it doesn't, it won't. So for about 20 years, I had a very close friendship with a person who was a sculptor. He did this as his professional thing. He was a figurative sculptor. And so I got to see intimately everything that goes on behind the scenes when a commissioned work comes into being. And I think it's really important for us to know how many people are involved in something like this and what a dependent arising this all is, and how intentional the outcome is. It's very intentional. It has a big impact. It's meant to. So, what is a monument? Well, one definition is it's a type of structure that's explicitly created to commemorate a person or an event, or which has become important to a social group as part of their remembrance of historic times or cultural heritage, for example, historical architecture. Monuments and memorials are designed and created in various ways that seek to capture a moment from the past and sustain its influence in the present and on into the future. We need to think about this, the kind of impact that is intentionally set up for a monument. The desire to remember an event or a person for all time is a powerful force, and visual reminders such as monuments and memorials have an important place in every culture from time immemorial. Each culture creates its own unique memorials, and by examining these, we can better understand the cultures that produce them. So how does this whole monument thing start? Well, in my experience, what I saw, it starts with one individual who gets an idea for a sculpture. And then that person starts talking to people, unless they're independently wealthy or they're a head of state, then they have to gather people together, and you have to come up with, okay, what is this for? And what values do we want this whole thing to represent? So this takes a long time, just that we know here from the Abbey committee work takes a long time. Agreeing on things and coming to a decision takes some time and skill. So this brainstorming part of what is it going to be, what is this image going to be like, can take weeks, it can take months, it can take years. And then as this is going on, then people are also thinking about the financial side of it, like what is it going to cost? How big is this monument going to be? Usually monuments are larger than life size, because you want to create an impact. A life-size human figure is actually makes people upset. It's just too small. So you want to have something very big. So then you have to start, once you've got sort of an idea, then you start talking to people about, the fundraising part. We need to get a press group going. We need to release the information to the public that we want to generate funds for this and why this is an important thing to do. And then you start looking for an artist. So usually there's press releases that are sent out for artists to apply for. So any number of people apply. Some of them are artists, some of them aren't, because usually with a monument it looks like a lot of money is involved. In the end, what the artists get is actually very little. So the committee starts searching for the artist. They invite artists to send in sketches at first. So they do all these sketches, and then the group looks at the sketches, they look at the resume of the artist. They want to make sure that the artist is the real thing. The Pend d'Oreille County might take a look at this process and find out who the artist is. What have they done that shows that it can actually produce a monument, because it's so complex. And then they reduce the committee then reduces the number of artists to maybe 5 people, who then have to produce a little maquette, a little model of the monument. And then they look at all the maquettes, and then they select the winner artist. Sometimes Sometimes, quite often it's a political choice. Sometimes the best artist actually wins the competition. And then from there, actually I should back up a bit just to show you how intentional this is. If the artist is worth his or her merit, a lot of research goes into what the memorial is all about. So let's say it's a person. So you take a look at the person's life, you comb through libraries and look for photographs, you try and dig up every bit of evidence you can find that describes who this person is. And if it's a period in time, then again, you're looking through libraries, getting the story on this event from many perspectives. So a good artist gets very informed. And then of course, through all this, which is usually years, everyone involved is telling their families about this whole monument process. Friends get involved with it. So it's a huge number of people who start becoming aware of what this is going to be about and what it will be. So the point I'm trying to make is that the final image is extremely well thought out, and the meaning of the monument is not vague. Usually not. Usually not. So I found a very good quote from a person by the name of Gregory Boucher, who's formerly a professor of classical and Near Eastern studies at Creighton University in Virginia. And he says this, and it's so true. Monuments tell us less about their subjects than about the people who raised them. These statues tell us a romanticized, white-centered myth of post-Civil War America that was subjective and self-serving, partisan and reconciliatory, noble and hurtful. This makes those monuments indispensable, he says, as markers of our growth as a nation, which we'll go on to debate a little bit later. So there's all kinds of articles about how we should be thinking about monuments these days. The New York Times says this: monuments celebrate origins. They demonstrate a community's symbolic honoring of events and people for qualities it finds indispensable to its identity. We should think about this criteria a lot. George Washington, whatever his flaws, is honored as father of this country. Memorials like the Wall of Veterans' names in Washington are meant to ensure that certain events and people will never be forgotten, even though in many cases we are ambivalent about some aspects of the events. While we honor the Vietnam sacrifice of the service members individually named, we are doubtful whether that war should have been fought at all. We wonder if it was escalated deceptively, strategically bungled, and tainted by racism and imperialism. By its very form, descending into the ground, it is memorial, not monumental. So then it gets very interesting about the current state of monuments in this country. So the Washington Post says this, which I had no idea about. Almost none of the monuments were put up right after the Civil War. Some were erected during the civil rights era of the early 1960s, which coincided with the war's centennial. But the vast majority of monuments date to between 1895 and World War I. They were part of a campaign to paint the Southern cause in the Civil War as just and slavery as a benevolent institution. And their installation came up against a backdrop of Jim Crow violence and oppression of African Americans. The monuments were put up as explicit symbols of white supremacy. Now, this is the part I did not know. Maybe you do. The group responsible for the majority of these memorials was the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Did you know that? The United Daughters of the Confederacy. They still exist. They were among the most influential white women's organizations in the South in the late 1800s and early 1900s. They were honoring Confederate heroes, generals, and soldiers. Hundreds of monuments were put up throughout the South and beyond, and they serve as a testimony to the Daughters' aggressive agenda to vindicate the Confederacy. The United Daughters of Confederacy and other like-minded heritage organizations were intent on honoring the Confederate generation and establishing a revisionist history of what they called the war between the states. According to this lost cause mythology, the South went to war to defend states' rights. Slavery was essentially a benevolent institution that imparted Christianity to the African savages. And while the Confederates were defeated, theirs was a just cause, and those who fought were heroes. The daughters regarded the Ku Klux Klan, which had been founded to resist Reconstruction, as a heroic organization necessary to return order to the South. Order, of course, meant the use of violence to subdue the newly freed Black people. So how many Confederate monuments are there in the US? A 2016 report from the Southern Poverty Law Center identified 718 Confederate monuments and statues scattered across the country, and not all of them are found in the southern states. This number does not include the schools, cities, counties, or holidays that honor the Confederacy in some way. The vast majority of these were built between the 1890s and 1950s, which matches up, as we heard before, with the era of Jim Crow segregation. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center's research, the biggest spike was between 1900 and the 1920s. All of those monuments were there to teach values to people. That's why they put them in city squares. That's why they put them in front of state buildings. The values these monuments stood for, he says, this is Eliot now, the author of this article, was simply a glorification of the cause of the Civil War. So now we'll fast forward to the present day. Protesters and city officials have taken down statues in a number of cities, and people in other parts of the country are calling on their elected officials to do the same. So this is where I'm wondering if there's maybe a conversation needed here, and we can look at some examples from around the world. First of all, we'll start with two people. Stonewall Jackson's great-great-grandsons have written an open letter to the mayor of Richmond, the former capital of the Confederacy, as well as the grandson's hometown, regarding Jackson's statue there. And they wrote this: "We are writing today to ask for the removal of his statue, as well as the removal of all Confederate statues from Monument Avenue," they wrote. "They are overt symbols of racism and white supremacy, and the time is long overdue for them to depart from public display." So we're going to take a look at a few other places in the world that have dealt with difficult imagery. There's a place in Budapest, in Hungary. It's called the Memento Park. And there, they took down a number of statues from the communist period, and they placed them all in a park for tourists and visitors and, the citizens to see. And they have signage there that explains that difficult period of history. So it's there very clearly as a testament to what happened and how we must learn from this period of time. But some statues in other places in the world, like South Africa, they had to be removed as a cathartic event, as in the Rhodes Must Fall movement. At first, this movement demanded the removal of some statues of Cecil Rhodes, a notorious white supremacist and British imperialist. But the movement became so powerful that it actually eventually sparked demands for the fall of Southern African head of state Jacob Zuma. Removing the statues relieved the accumulated social tensions. So some had to just come down. And as we know, in the case of Germany, initially they tried to remove every single image that would suggest the Nazi era. And they felt that this was really important to do, and they found that with this big effort in removing this thing, it didn't change things immediately like they hoped, and they have since discovered that it takes a lot of time and generational change and external events to make Germany what it is today. Tearing down the symbols of Nazi terror was a necessary first step, but it did not ensure overnight political or cultural transformation. So personally, I really deeply value and I appreciate the ways that the very difficult and painful periods of World War II have been preserved throughout the world. We need to be well informed about the past so that we can be prepared when similar circumstances arise, as it's happening now in this country. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, There are 917 active hate groups here. And the Southern Poverty Law Center is tracking more than 1,600 extremist groups. So I don't have any answers, and maybe people have some opinions in a moment. Perhaps each monument in this country needs to be considered one by one. If it's something that can receive appropriate signage, and the signage tells the story behind that event, maybe it's appropriate for that to stay. My experience with monuments is that people aren't too interested in reading. They look at the big monument and they see that this is what this country stands for. Maybe we need to do something like develop a section of the Smithsonian where all the statues are removed and they're placed in a very large place where the whole thing is explained like it's done in the Holocaust Museum. So if those of us in this room were invited to decide what to do with the monuments in this country that relate to this difficult period of time with Confederacy, what criteria would we use to determine what stays and what goes? And we'll do this quickly. What values do we want a monument to communicate now in this country? And this would probably help determine what stays and what goes. You can call it out. Okay, civility, diversity, inclusion. I'm sorry? Compassion. Respect. Human rights. Justice. Hope. Peace. Integrity. Are you getting all this board? In the camera? Okay. Integrity. Care for the environment and all sentient beings. Equality. I think that's a good start. And I think with this kind of list, that would determine what would happen to a lot of these monuments. So I don't know what the answer is. It's clear that something has to be done so that future generations really know that this is what's important for the United States of America and what's important for the world. Okay. Thank you.
Having worked at Child Protective Services for many years, one of the things that we were working on quite seriously was identifying trauma in families and children and doing our best not to re-traumatize them. And that included creating an environment in our office, our environment, wherever these families came, that minimize their exposure to traumatic triggers, to anything that might put them in the same, back to the same hurtful, painful space where they have been. And so when I look at these monuments, what I see are triggers for social trauma and triggers for the pain and the hurt that a significant chunk of the population has felt for a number of decades. And so from the social work point of view, these monuments only serve to bring to mind and perpetuate the pain, the hurt, the images, the trauma that has been inflicted on the African American population. And so that's I don't think that I have seen that point of view so much express, the clinical, psychological sort of point of view that these things do that to people.
I like how you mentioned that the monuments and the statues were part of the reconciliation process, and the South was defeated, and I'm sure they were very upset about that. And to sort of save their pride, they had to glorify their cause, and so the putting up of all those statues might have been part of a healing process, but clearly it's not the best way to heal. And now we're entering a new phase. I mean, the war is long behind us, and I think now is a time to really start questioning whether those monuments are doing any good whatsoever. Maybe they did in the past, but I think the people are having a conversation now about, let's change our identity altogether. Let's move away from that completely. So it's interesting to look at like a evolution of social values, what's going on. And but yeah, like maybe they did have a purpose at some point, to keep the country together, but now it's we have better ways and ideas of doing that.
I don't see those statues as having a healing effect or being motivated by a healing effect, because they were glorifying the good old days and rewriting history. And when you refuse to be honest about something, and instead invent an alternative history, that is not healing. That is deception.
I can read you something that I thought I didn't have time to read about the United Daughters of Confederacy, and we'll get to you in a moment, Toji. Just to show you what was going on. This is a very powerful group of people. So in the 1890s, when the United Daughters of Confederacy was founded and monument building began in earnest, it happened during the decade of virulent racism across the South. Not content to disenfranchise black men, Southern whites went on a lynching spree. Ida B. Wells, the African-American journalist and anti-lynching crusader, documented 186 lynchings of black people in 1893 alone, mostly men, but women and children too. And as she wrote in her account, The Red Record, these scenes of unusual brutality failed to have any visible effect upon the humane sentiments of the people of our land. Violence against blacks only increased in the early decades of the 20th century. In addition to the continued lynching across the South, the Atlanta race riot of 1906 demonstrated how seriously white men took their supremacy over African Americans. And it was during this period that they were putting out more and more of these monuments. So they were really meant to make a very big statement.
Thank you for sharing this, Venerable. There is a famous saying, history is written by the victor. And indeed, I believe that there is definitely a difference between the neo-Confederates, racial supremacists, versus the actual Confederates during the Civil War era. The people today, they're taking that title and twisting it. But I mean, the Confederates themselves too, it is a documented fact that they also had ethnic minorities, blacks, Latinos, Asians, Jewish, and even some natives on the Confederate side during the war. So it was more complex. It wasn't just like only white supremacist during that time. It was more like a Southern nationalist. And at the same time, I feel the danger in taking side in any war is to side with any group, because both sides committed atrocities. Both the Union and the Confederacy, they both engaged in violence, killing each other. There was brothers against brothers, fathers against sons on opposing sides. And the Union military, the United States, just as the Confederates did crimes, the United States also committed war crimes too. And of course, many people will feel hurt by the Confederate statues because of what happened. And at the same time, many people, for example, will feel hurt by the United States military statues because the US military continued its campaign of genocide against the native peoples up until the early 1900s. But the US military is celebrated throughout the country. And there are very few people who are vocal about removing those statues. Like Andrew Jackson, he was a war criminal. And he's on the $20 bill. They call him an Indian slayer. He personally massacred many native peoples. And because the US won the war, the crimes which the US committed is not really acknowledged. I think that's the danger of the state of mind in this country is it's true that other countries are committing crimes too, but we shouldn't justify bombing another country while we're committing crimes. I think that's the danger, and I believe in any war of two parties fighting violently and killing each other, we should not support either side. We must attain complete, total non-violence and not support any side which is using arms. Just like that Vietnamese monk during the Vietnam War, he didn't side with the government in South Vietnam, which was supported by the US, or the communists in North Vietnam. He was neutral. He was just following Dharma. He didn't take any sides. And he wrote that his followers, Buddhist peacekeepers, they were targeted by both sides. They had grenades thrown at them and everything. So I think as Buddhists, we must always follow the middle path and absolute nonviolence, no matter what. And the situation, what's happening in Myanmar too, for me, the fear that I have, or I feel like what they're speaking about this conflict, many times they will justify, let's go bomb Myanmar now to restore peace and order. But by bombing another country or invading another country, it will never bring peace. It will make more violence and more war and more suffering, no matter what. Thank you.